Now, before we get started, we need to talk about the elephant in the room. Why were people willing to walk thousands of miles to die in the desert when the Pope told them to? The backstory lies in the riveting topic of church land management. Deal with it. So, churches in the Middle Ages weren't next to a Best Buy or down the street from McDonald's. They were solitary buildings in a big field and they owned the land around it. The local bishop or abbot in charge was basically a landlord and peasants living nearby had to pay them taxes. When the bishop died, the local ruler can replace them with anyone they want. Now, they might appoint someone holy, or maybe they give the church to their alcoholic nephew as a birthday gift. Usually the latter. Fact is, it's hard to feel close to God during Mass if the bishop leading the sermon is hungover from a night of partying with his uncle the Duke. In general, hypocrites don't inspire religious devotion. Then, long story short and oversimplified, there were a few church reforms which led to bishops, not dukes, choosing who replaces them, which led to fewer alcoholics and more holy people getting appointed. And Catholics started developing genuine religious devotion because their religious leaders actually practiced what they preached. Who would have guessed? And it is this religious revival that made the Crusades possible.
With context given, the story starts with the Roman Empire. 500 years before the Crusades, half of the Roman Empire was conquered, including Rome. Then later they lost half of the half. Then even later they lost half of the half of the half. After getting Thanos snapped for the third time, the last two by Muslims, the Romeless Empire, which we'll call the Byzantines for the rest of the story, asked the Pope for help taking back lost territory.
The Pope obliged and called for a crusade and said people could go to heaven if they fought in the Middle East. He expected only a few thousand knights, medieval tanks on horses whose jobs were literally just fighting, to respond. However, there's no telephones in medieval Europe, so word travels through medieval Europe like a game of telephone. And the religious revival affected the message a lot. The call for some knights to fight for the Byzantines changed to everyone and their mother marching to take back Jerusalem, which was also under Muslim control. So instead of just a few thousand knights, giant mobs formed of tens of thousands of people, ranging from a few nobles to a bunch of knights to a great gaggle of peasants, all prepared to go retake the Holy Land for Jesus. Now you might be wondering, how prepared were people for this? They weren't. No one has any idea how far the journey was. There were no good maps back then, and most people never left their kingdom, let alone continent. Jerusalem is 3,000 miles away, and cars hadn't been invented yet. It's like walking from New York to Los Angeles, but everything west of the Rocky Mountains is trying to kill you. A peasant crusade of 20,000 peasants didn't wait for the nobles and knights, people who could afford armor, and went by themselves. They all died. Then the main group went next. So, after making their way through Europe with relatively minimal war crimes, the main crusading armies entered Byzantine territory, and the Byzantines were not happy to see them. They were expecting a few thousand knights, not a random mob of tens of thousands of unwashed, unruly peasants. But hey, an army is an army, and former Byzantine territory was on the way to Jerusalem anyway. Through psychological and physical coercion, the Byzantines made the Crusader leaders promise to give back any land that used to belong to them, then dump the mobs into enemy territory. You see, the crusading army is like a hot potato. The longer you hold on to it, the more likely they will snap and sack the closest city. It's best to keep tossing it along to the next unsuspecting victim. The holy hot potato now in enemy territory, no one really knew what would happen. Western Europeans hadn't fought the Muslim Turks before. Except the peasant crusaders, of course, and the main army got to see their bodies lining the road. After some walking, the crusaders besieged Nicaea, a former Byzantine city. The army of rabid foreigners scared the Turks silly and, anticlimactically, they surrendered overnight. Thus, the Byzantines already got a return on their investment. The crusaders then split into two groups, the Norman army and the French army. And they did not like each other, until the Turks gave them a bonding exercise by attacking near the city of Dorylaeum. The knights joined together, got on horses, formed a line, and charged. The Turks aren't used to heavily armored maniacs charging headfirst toward them, and fled. Turns out the Byzantines were right, knights were effective against the Turks. And it was all smooth sailing from here. Wait, no. The Turks scorched the earth, destroying wells so the Crusaders couldn't get any water in the desert. And as the Crusaders traveled mountain paths, many carts, horses, and men fell to their deaths. The Crusaders were also constantly harassed by the Turks. Even with every victory, they are bleeding men they cannot replace. Problem is, the Crusade had become the embodiment of the sunken cost fallacy. They were too deep to go back now, and anyone who did was mocked until they died. Also, around here the first Crusader state was born. The Armenians revolted against their Turkish overlords and literally adopted a Crusader to be their king. It did not matter that the Armenians weren't Catholic. It was an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. And there is no greater enemy to Armenians than the Turks. Thus, the Crusader state of Odessa was founded. Then the Crusaders reached the giant city of Antioch. By luck, the main Turkish army was attacking Odessa, thinking there was a big army there, which gave the Crusaders time to take the city after a hellish siege. They looted and pillaged and killed every Muslim they could find. And then karma hit them hard. The Turks realized Odessa has like 7 people and surrounded Antioch, and the Crusaders were stuck inside the city with no food because they just sieged it. This would have been the end of the First Crusade if not for Peter the con artist. He claimed that under the local church was the Holy Lance that stabbed Jesus, and with its holy power they could beat the Turks. They dug halfway to China and couldn't find anything. Then Pete jumped in the hole and came out with a chunk of rusted metal that was definitely there before and definitely the spear. Whether the Crusaders genuinely believed it or were just too delirious from hunger to care, they opened the gates and charged directly into the Turkish army. And the Turkish army was defeated and retreated. And it was all thanks to the power of Jesus and definitely not because the Turkish army was politically divided and many subjects saw the battle as a good time to abandon ship. Nope, definitely Jesus. Also, technically the Byzantines should have got the city, but they never showed up to help, so one Crusader just kind of kept it. So yeah, Antioch becomes another Crusader state. From here, the Crusaders are finally in the ballpark of Jerusalem, and it only took 3 years. All that was left was only 300 miles through a desert populated by more Muslim infidels. It was, surprisingly, a cakewalk. In a bizarre enemy of my enemy is my friend situation, the local Muslim population sold them food and horses and pointed them in the right direction. Thing is, contrary to popular belief, the crusade wasn't all Christians versus all Muslims. Most kings in Europe ignored the Pope's call for a crusade, and the various groups in the Crusader army were always arguing with each other. Likewise, the Muslim world wasn't any more united. Among the Muslims were Sunnis and Shias, different cultural groups like Turks and Arabs, and a bunch of competing tribes, and many hated each other more than they hated the invading Crusaders. The Fatimids were a massive empire with a huge army, and they knew the Crusaders were coming and ordered their army by Jerusalem to fall all the way back to Egypt. This is where the Crusades' lack of logic comes in clutch. The Fatimids thought no one would be stupid enough to march 3,000 miles for Jerusalem, which was an undefendable city in the middle of the desert. Egypt, the center of the Fatimid Empire, was right next door, 1,000 times more valuable, and must have been the goal. And thus, there was no one in the Crusaders' way, and the Crusaders reached Jerusalem with tears of joy and then tears of depression, because Jerusalem had a big wall and a lot of soldiers. It suddenly became a race against the clock, because the Crusaders couldn't afford a siege because they were out of food. And the Fatimids realized the Crusaders really were that stupid and were marching back from Egypt. And just when all seems lost, the crusading army is deus ex machina'd when an Italian fleet shows up and lets the Crusaders dismantle their ships to build siege towers. The Crusaders take the walls, then run down and open the gates of the city for the rest of the army. They rush in and launch a celebratory massacre of the population. Thus coronated in blood, the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem is founded. And against all odds and logic, the crusade was a success. And now you have a collection of Catholic kingdoms surrounded on all sides by sand and infidels, and their only Christian neighbor for 1,000 miles, the Byzantines, despises them. What could possibly go wrong? If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button, and if you want to see more badly oversimplified history, hit the subscribe and bell buttons. And don't forget to yell at me in the comments about everything I oversimplified or left out. If you want to learn more, check out Extra Credits series on the First Crusade, the link will be in the description. And finally, a word from today's sponsor. Alright, there is none. This is a new channel. But if you want to personally enable the coffee addiction that fuels video creation, check out the Patreon link also in the description. The second video will be on the Second Crusade, a bold and shocking move, I know. That's all for now, folks. Goodbye. Now go outside.